Welcome to this course on an introduction to data science. So before we get started, I want to just kind of give you a bit about my background. So my classical training is in molecular biology. I did my graduate work at UC San Diego. I worked at the Salk Institute, and it was a really exciting time in molecular biology. So this was in the early 2000s. Big genome sequencing was just starting to kind of take off. Craig Ventner, when I first started, had just finished sequencing the human genome. People at the Salk Institute, Joe Ecker in particular, was sequencing mRNAs and looking at global gene expression sorts of data, where we could look at all the potential proteins that were going to be produced by an organism at a certain time point. And so there was this huge amount of data coming into biology. And at the time, I was kind of peripherally involved in that. I was working on specific genes and specific protein-protein interactions. But I was right next to all this really exciting stuff going on. And it really started making me think about data science and how do you deal with these big data structures? And in the process, I kind of was stuck in that kind of white castle of academia and focused on my own work. But it's been influencing me and sitting in the back of my mind for years now. And after I finished my graduate work and did a postdoc working on algae biofuels, which turned out to be an economically not viable attempt to kind of solve our fuel problems at the current juncture, I decided to move into computer science and kind of remove that black box of biology and move into these silver boxes of computers. And that transition really has allowed me to kind of dig into data science and computer science and really think about how to attack those big pieces of data. And so the goal of this course isn't really to show you all the amazing things that you can do with data science, but really talk about kind of the big picture of data science and what is data science. I think a lot of people are kind of unclear as to what data science is, and then from there kind of give you some basic tools to kind of attack some data science yourself. And we'll talk about why you want to have those basic tools in place and kind of where you can go from there. So with that, let's go ahead and start off and talk a little bit about data science and what is data science. And then throughout the rest of the program, we're going to talk about data organization in our next chapter, data visualization, data analytics, how to become a data scientist, and then finally, as I said, we're going to kind of give a little bit of a demo on using Excel. All right, so what is data science? So there are kind of two major pieces of data science. The first one is this idea of just data analysis. And so a lot of jobs and companies that are looking for data scientists are really looking for somebody that's an expert in data analysis. So this is somebody that can take data, and with that data, they can make these really cool inferences or extrapolate information that's valuable to the company. So that's kind of one side of data science. But there's kind of a second side of data science, and that's really the scientific approach to data itself. And this would be what sort of mechanisms or strategies are used to best attack a data set. So data is just data, right? So it doesn't matter if it comes from a biological system or a physics system or from internet use or wherever that data comes from. It doesn't really make a difference. It's really about the fact that it is data and it has certain behaviors that one can apply and apply scientific methods effectively to it. And so that's kind of the second part of data science. So data analysis is kind of one aspect of where it's like, hey, I'm going to use these tools to really create a really good predictive model or whatever. And I should say, there's the second type, which is kind of this more academic structure, which is like, how do I best attack data? So do I use clustering? Do I use a neural net? Do I use a support vector machine to attack this data in the most effective way? And so there's that kind of split in what a data scientist is. And so I think that generates some of the nebulousness of hey, what is a data scientist? And so it's kind of both these pieces that have kind of been munged into and collapsed into one thing. And so how did data science really kind of get its feet under itself? So it started off kind of potentially as an evolution of applied statistics, but you could also think of it as an evolution of computer science. So if we look at the scientific method, kind of the general plan with the scientific method is you have data, right? And you're looking at that data and you want to understand it, right? The goal of a scientist is to understand how things work, right? So you're going to ask a question about that data. So you have this question in mind, and you're going to make a hypothesis as to why that happens. So you have this kind of model, which is this hypothesis of like, hey, the answer to my question is blah, right? So then you set up an experiment, then you analyze the results of that experiment, and then you either say, hey, this is a result, like the data so far fit this hypothesis, so I'm going to kind of present that as like, hey, my hypothesis is working. I might have generated some new data that like allows me to subtly mutate or change my hypothesis. Or I might be like, hey, this is a really cool result. Let's talk and share it with the world. But the majority of the time, what happens is you get your data back and you're like, oh, that doesn't really fit my hypothesis, or it doesn't fit it as well as I would like. And so you end up with this kind of iteration and this iterative cycle. So you basically go hypothesis, experiment, analyze, hypothesize again, experiment, analyze, and repeat. And so one of the slowest points of that process in some cases is the analysis of that data, right? So you get all this data back, and now you have to do all these analyses to say, hey, does that actually fit my hypothesis? And so you might have, at the time, 10,000 points of data, or even 100,000 points of data. And if you had to do that by hand, or even write your own computer program to do it, that writing and doing it by hand just takes a lot of time. And so computers came in and said, hey, we can, well, the computers didn't say anything, but we could use computers to do that analysis. And so that's kind of the first chunk of data science, is doing that analysis. But over time, it started to evolve, where not only do we need to do the analysis, or can we do the analysis, we can also have it do different hypotheses. And so an example of this might be, hey, we're going to predict that two events, so let's just call them X and Y, fit together and correlate with a straight line. And so we generate that hypothesis, and we try to draw a whole bunch of lines, mx plus b sort of lines, where there's these straight lines, and we're like, oh, does that fit these data points? And what's the best fit of that data point? But that's great. But you could maybe fit those data better with a polynomial, so some sort of curved line. And every time you change that line shape, you have to change all this analysis, and you're basically running a different hypothesis on that data. You're saying, hey, this line fits best, or this polynomial line fits best, or this logarithmic line fits best. And so each one of those takes a lot of time. And so you as a person would have to come up with all those different hypotheses and run that experiment and then do the data analysis, and hopefully the computer would do the data analysis for you. But people realize that there's no reason that you have to come up with that hypothesis each time. You could run a suite of hypotheses, and basically computer science has started to evolve where it's basically doing the hypothesis, the experiment, and then the analysis, kind of that whole chunk. And some of the really cool AI stuff is actually even starting to kind of move out and take, and really attack the questions that are there. So it's not just doing the hypothesis, experiment, analysis side of kind of the scientific method. We're moving into having those machines actually ask the question and look at the data, and kind of taking this whole loop. And so that's kind of the future, I think, of some pieces of data science and AI. Awesome. So what have some of the successes of data science been? So obviously Google, so search engine optimization has been a huge hit for a number of companies. And the reason it's a hit is basically these companies are taking in this tremendous amount of data about someone, right? We're generating all this, what's called data exhaust, as we go through the world. What we search on the internet, all those information pieces, what ads we look at, et cetera, all get kind of collected by someone. And because those data are collected, you can analyze that data and generate, hey, maybe this person's going to buy this product in the next year. So maybe we want to send them a few extra ads in that area. And basically Google said, hey, let's take that data, let's sell that data basically to bring in more ad revenue. And that was kind of their basic general model. But basically that was all this kind of iteration of, let's make some, we have this data, let's make a hypothesis about it, let's experiment on it, let's analyze it, and see what kind of best ads we can send to people that have these particular sets of behaviors. But other things that have been extremely successful, Amazon has basically gone through all of their product catalog, and they have an algorithm that goes through it and makes sure that the prices don't have any weird price anomalies, so that they're actually able to make sure that they have a certain margin. Even if it's a small loss in some cases, they can minimize that margin, and so they don't have these, every once in a while they'll have these weird price anomalies that they used to. UPS, when it kind of did its right turn algorithm, so if you haven't heard about this, UPS, and I think most shipping companies, spend the majority of their money on fuel. And so if you can minimize how much fuel you're using as a driver, you can maximize your cost. And so they basically applied a learning algorithm to driving routes to kind of minimize the amount of fuel that a driver is going to be using. And so again, they're kind of using this iterative attack on data. So data science, as we kind of mentioned, has solved a bunch of kind of interesting problems, but it's used all over the place. So small businesses can benefit from good data analysis and good data scientists. You could have great information coming out in genomics. We already talked about search engine optimization. Literature, looking at historical literature and looking at kind of what verbiage was being used can be really interesting. So there's all these kind of really some of them are esoteric, some are really, apropos to the times, politics, all these things that are being attacked from this kind of data-rich environment. And so we need all these tools to kind of really expand our knowledge about these different things. And so that's why data science is so exciting right now. So with that said, hopefully you kind of have a general sense of what a data scientist is. But just to reiterate, so a data scientist is someone who either can think about data and kind of their approach to data and how to analyze data in general, is kind of one kind of the academic side of it. But it's also taking all the tools that academic side are generating and applying them to different types of data. And being like, okay, so I'm going to use a support vector machine to figure out how these things cluster together. And then that will lead to different outcomes. So how do you become a data scientist? I think there are three major pieces. So the first piece is organizing data. Data come in a whole bunch of different forms, whether it's a spreadsheet or streaming video. You really need to be able to take that data and put it into some format that your system can deal with. If your system is just you, that's fine. I mean, you as a person can be a data scientist. The next piece is visualization of data. So being able to kind of look at data and see it yourself, whether that's a visual representation of data or maybe some other type of representation of data. And also being able to present that data in a visual format that somebody that's not as familiar with data can understand. I think those are two critical pieces. So visualization is kind of split into two pieces. And the last piece is data analysis. And this is kind of the fun part of data. Being a data scientist is like, how do you attack your data such that you understand it better and you can kind of really dig into it and get that really insightful gold nugget that's often hiding in the data, such that you can be like, oh, that's a really interesting hypothesis, that's a really interesting result that comes out from these data. Maybe we should move our company in this direction. So those are kind of the three pieces of data scientists, of being a data scientist, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of chapters. So thank you. Welcome back to part 2 on this introduction to data science. So today what we're going to be talking about is data organization. So one of the biggest pieces of being a data scientist is organizing data. So I have this kind of fake infographic here. 62% of time is spent organizing data. But really, it's just the majority of time. So you're going to get these data from different sources, and you really want to try to understand what they are, but also data aren't coming in cleanly a lot of times. So an example is a spreadsheet. So maybe a whole bunch of people at your company have access to a certain spreadsheet, and the way they enter data are different. So maybe some people use text in a column that should be all numbers, or maybe they leave it blank every once in a while. And so all of these things can affect your ability to analyze that data effectively. And so you have to go through and kind of munge that data and clean it up to make sure that you can actually use it. And as the data sets get larger and larger, the amount of time that you spend doing that and kind of fixing things that are not right becomes greater and greater. So that's one really big aspect of kind of being a data scientist is just sitting and working with data such that you can get into a format that you can actually use. You know, setting up your columns and rows and making sure that you have potentially multiple rows that are kind of describing things, so you can organize it better later on. All those things are part of this cleaning up and organizing data. In addition, not all data types come in this sort of tabular form, right? So data scientists are dealing with live streaming video, as I mentioned. And how do you deal with this information that's coming in? How do you deal with this audio signal that's coming in? So those data are totally different than what you think of, or we generally think of as you know, an Excel table. But they're important types of data, and you need to figure out how to deal with them. So again, just to kind of reiterate on this point, organizing data is like a huge part of being a data scientist. And it's kind of fun once you kind of get used to it, but it takes a little bit of time to kind of get your hands around data and you know, really feel comfortable and being fun. But let's just talk about kind of how I break apart organizing data. And I'm going to do this for each of these three pieces of organizing data, visualizing data, and analyzing data. I kind of split it into three different levels with some examples. And so a great track to becoming a data scientist is kind of work through each level by itself, but that's not the only track. So let's just go ahead and start in talking about the kind of the three levels of organizing data. So the first one is kind of this level 1 data, and these are going to be like Excel tables. So you know, these are things that you'd see in a small business where you're getting, you know, your company has, you know, information about it, you know, in this one table in kind of a pretty organized structure. So maybe it's a MySQL table that you're pulling in from MySQL or some other database as well, but it's generally quite structured and quite tabular. The second level is going to be these sort of, you know, more complicated data types. So, you know, genomics is the example that we're going to talk about today, but it's not just genomics. It's basically when you're pulling in data from different locations and trying to integrate it. So maybe you are working at a mid-sized company that's dealing with shipping, and you want to look at shipping over time, and you noticed kind of these weird trends that there were these downtimes in shipping, and so maybe you're, as a data scientist, you're wanting to pull in weather information at the same time, and so your Excel table that you're using for your company doesn't have weather information, so you're having to go and get that data from somewhere else and bring it in. And so you're doing these mashups of data. And so kind of level 2 is really being really comfortable mashing up that data and bringing it into these more complicated formats. And then level 3 is kind of this next step. And it's not necessarily a step in the level 3 stuff. It's dealing with data types that are just non-uniform. Some of these data types that are just things that you aren't used to dealing with and figuring out how to deal with those. And so those are kind of my 3 levels of being a data scientist and organizing data. So let's just talk about level 1 and 2, or level 1 first, and then we'll move into level 2 and then into level 3. And throughout this course, once we get into the demos, we're going to be focusing on kind of this level 1, maybe a little bit into the level 2 stuff. I think some of the other courses that are out there, so Microsoft has a great certificate program that really talks about moving from level 1 to level 3 on some of these things. And so if you're wanting to explore more after this set of courses, or you're just like, I love data science, I just want to jump right into that, that's a great place to start. So, cool. All right, so level 1 data. I think most everybody's seen this sort of data. You know, it's this sort of common tabular format where you have information in columns and rows. Each row generally is one piece of information about a product or a date or some sort of thing. So, you know, here's an example of maybe just a profit chart that you might see in a small company. So, as we kind of go through this, I want to point out a few different things. So you'll notice on line 5 here, this data, as we mentioned, isn't really clean, right? So we have all these numbers that are formatted in dollars, and then we have this random string of 14. And so these features of these level 1 data types are generally, they're pretty humanly readable. So there's not like, you know, 1 million or 2 million or 100 million lines of different data. It's something that you could read through and scroll through yourself. So maybe there's 100,000 of them. You could still do that yourself and do it in a reasonable amount of time. So humanly readable, usually fairly clean, so you're not having to change a lot of things, maybe a few things that you're going to have to go through and edit. And it's usually coming from a single source. And so, as I said, where you'd see this sort of thing is maybe small businesses, maybe in the biology scene, you'd see them in FDA trials of well-designed experiments, that sort of thing. But having a simple data set doesn't really mean the analysis is automatically simple. So in fact, small data sets can actually be harder to analyze in some ways because you don't understand what's going on in the data. There just aren't enough data points to really get your head around them. So that's kind of the general sense with level 1 data. So what sort of tools would you want to have as a level 1 data organization, data scientist? Well, obviously you want to be able to use spreadsheets or deal with tabular data. There's some great tools for kind of organizing data. So Excel is great, Power BI is great. You probably want to understand some basic SQL querying and different types of data formats that are tabular in nature, but maybe not in format. So comma-separated value files, for example, is a really common data type format. So these are formats where basically instead of rows and columns, you have enter generating a new row and commas separating each column. Cool. All right, so moving on to level 2 data. So level 2 data are data that may not be humanly readable, but are still parsable. Here's an example of a gene sequence. So basically just a whole bunch of A's, T's, C's, and G's. And right, if an average one of us looks at this, they're gonna be like, okay, that's great. But we can't really do anything with that in its current format. We can do a few things, but just it's not very usable. And so a level 2 data scientist might be taking this data and applying some different structures to it. So we know that genes can be turned into proteins, and there's some rules about doing that, right? And so basically, DNA has codons in it, and those codons can get turned into proteins through transcription and translation. And so we know those rules, we know how to do it. And so this data set might turn into some sort of column and row sort of level 1 data in the following manner. So basically, all I did is counted the number of nucleotides in the sequence and then converted it into a protein, found the longest reading frame and said, hey, the protein length is going to be 566 amino acids. So that's just an example of kind of taking multiple pieces of information, bringing them in, and then turning them into something that's a little bit more digestible. And so that's kind of the goal of the level 2 aspect of data organization. And so sometimes it's humanly readable and just, you bring in multiple tables. Other times, you might need some domain expertise to kind of really get your hands into that data. And where you're going to see this sort of data, are genomics, larger corporate entities, potentially like streaming data that's coming back with really clear formatting, but it's coming fairly quickly. So all those things are kind of this level 2 data structure, and where you're really getting and organizing this stuff in a really tangible and parsable manner. Cool. So again, some tools that you really want to have kind of down when you're jumping into that level 2 and moving on to that level 2. Again, you're going to be using Power BI probably, or Tableau, or some of these similar tools. But you're also going to be starting to dive into some sort of programming language. So it's really hard to look at a million rows of data and bring over tables together and then clean that data up without some sort of statistical programming package. So some of the ones that people are commonly using, Python with Pandas or Spark, R, you'll see some Java, and you'll also see some functional programming stuff with Scala. So as you move from this level 1 to level 2, you're going to kind of move from this really clear, readable data to kind of this abstract, a slightly more abstract level. And so being able to kind of pull things in and understand that how you're pulling them in without really seeing all the data right there. So cool. So the skills that you want to have, you definitely want to be able to match up data. You want some sort of data intuition. So when you look at some of your visualizations, you kind of know how you're going to potentially attack it later. Because you can't do everything visually because there's just too much information there potentially, or it's not humanly readable, you really need to be confident in your ability to programmatically clean up that data. So this is kind of data munging. And so you really want to be trusting of your skill set and be like, oh, everywhere there's a 0, I'm going to convert that to a 42 because it makes sense to do that for this particular data set. Maybe we're trying to figure out what the meaning of the world is or something. So those are kind of the skills that you want to have. And again, although I kind of want to emphasize this point of data scientists being kind of data agnostic, like you can bring in information from wherever and apply these really standardized best models and best attack methods to attack that data. In some instances, data area or subject area knowledge is actually advantageous. So, so it's not something to be ignored, but I do like this idea of, even if it's just a theoretical idea of data scientists being kind of data type or data source agnostic. So cool. So let's move on to level 3 data organization. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but level 3 data organization is really when you're starting to get and deal with non-uniform data. So, we talked about this idea of data exhaust in our first chapter. So this idea that as we move through the world, we're doing all these things that are being picked up by our behavior. So our searches, maybe traffic cameras, maybe if you're using a smart fridge, all these things are generating data. And there's so much data that's coming through that one of the strategies that people have used is like, we're just going to collect this stuff. We don't care how we collect it, how organized we are about collecting it. We're just going to grab it. So by grabbing it and just having it there for us, we need some way to deal with that. And figuring out how to restructure that data from this kind of unstructured format and bring it into something that we can actually use is a big part of this level 3 data organization. In addition, you're going to be dealing with things that are just huge amounts of data, where you're basically getting so much information in that maybe your machine can't deal with all that data at one point, so you're going to have to use distributed systems, or that data is coming in so quickly and you want to get it back out in some sort of digested format very quickly as well. So real-time integration, where you're trying to really optimize how you're organizing that data and how you're spitting it back into different locations. And so that's kind of the level 3 data set or skill set that I think you really want to have down if you want to be a level 3 data organization piece of the data scientist collection. So what sort of tools would you want for being level 3? So again, now we're moving into specifically into programming. So you're going to be using Python, you're going to be using R, Scala, and you're really going to be wanting to know how to deal with distributed systems. So Hadoop or Pig or Hive are some of these just databases that can really are set up to deal with big data sets. And once you kind of have those down and you're able to take in information kind of from anywhere and bring it in, you should feel confident that you're kind of this level 3 data organization piece. And one of the things I want to kind of just bring up one more time is, a data scientist doesn't have to be level 3 on every single thing. So somebody that's level 3 on data organization is extremely valuable, because you might have a level 3 data analyst out there who's just going to take that data once you've generated it and just make some amazing conclusions off of it. And so, science in general has progressed from this idea of, you're an individual that can do everything to this kind of collaborative environment. And data organization or data scientists are no exception to that. There's a bunch of really specialized skill sets, and you could be great at all of them, or you could work as a team and be just phenomenal at one of them and let your other team members kind of take over those other roles for you. So don't be afraid to, like, hey, I love doing this one aspect of data science, and think that that's not valuable, because it is. Right? So next we're going to be talking about data visualization. Welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about part 3, data visualization. So remember, there's kind of these 3 pieces of becoming a data scientist that you really should be working towards mastery in. So data organization, visualization, and data analysis. So just like with data organization and what's coming up in data analysis, we're dividing data visualization up into kind of 3 levels. So the first level is kind of the typical stuff that you're going to be seeing, again, using Excel, Power BI, where you're generating these sort of really kind of classical data presentations. So, you're talking about trending and histograms and trend lines and kind of this level that's, some pretty basic statistics plus, nice visual graphics that, most everybody can understand and has seen before. Ideally with all of these final types of presentations, the thing about them is you can make the most amazing graphic, but if it's something that somebody can't understand, it's really not very useful. And so just keep that in mind. So there's some really beautiful things that you can do with data visualization, and sometimes it does not make the science clear. So even though you really want kind of this artistic background with your data presentation, make sure that it's clearly illustrating what you needed to illustrate for your audience for the presentation side. So let's jump into level 1, data science, or data visualization, and then kind of talk about what that means. And then we'll move into kind of the level 2 and the level 3 stuff. And data visualization and data analysis kind of have this interesting jump that we'll talk about later in their level 3 stuff. And just to kind of give you a primer to what we'll talk about, there's this trend in data science to move away from kind of this classical statistics and kind of model-based approach to this machine learning approach. And both level 2 or level 3 stuff in visualization as well as in analysis, kind of we'll talk about that a little bit more and kind of why that trend's occurring and what it means. So, cool. So, again, visualization, kind of there's 2 pieces of visualization. First is you understanding the data, and then the second piece is explaining results to other people. And so that's kind of why in the hierarchy of events, we have organize the data and then visualize the data and then analyze the data, because you really want to understand what you're trying to do with your data prior to running an analysis on your data. So getting that data intuition is really key, and a really easy way to get initial data kind of understanding is to visualize it. So here's an example of visualization. So maybe you have a bunch of different data points, and they're kind of, they're just thousands of data points, and you don't know what they are. So there's some kind of trends in data science that you want to be able to predict behaviors based on some sort of dynamic of the data. And so a very common one that you hear about is like a normal distribution. And these are these nice bell-shaped curves that a lot of you have seen, so Gaussian distributions and that sort of thing. But with just looking at a data set, you have no idea if it's going to be fitting a Gaussian curve, or it might look like something like this, where you have these these 2 separate humps. And so you want to be able to see that in some manner. So whether or not you can, or one of those people can just visualize it yourself, which is a very, very, very small percentage of us. But most of us need some sort of representation. So the histogram is a super common one. Basically, it says, how many times did a certain event occur? So, how many students got A's, B's, C's, or D's are kind of maybe some different bins that you might want to put something in. And actually in education, that's a very common thing, is to see these bimodal distributions where you have kind of one peak at one location, kind of the AB range, and another peak down at the DF range, at least in like the high school level. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that, but a lot of it's just student engagement and things that are going on in students' lives. So you get these interesting distributions. So you want to be able to see that. And so before you analyze your data, because you can't do all the same things if the data are not normally distributed, you can't run t-tests very easily. You can't do some of the things where you're saying, hey, this is 3 standard deviations away from the mean, so it's something that's probable to happen or not to happen. If you're 3 standard deviations away from the mean, it's 99% chance that it's not related to that mean, or is a pretty far outlier. So understanding that is super important, and kind of knowing what your data look like and knowing what sort of tools you can use are absolutely critical. So the second piece is the more classical presentation sort of thing. So an example, there's some great tools out there right now. So Excel has continues to make amazing changes where you can basically say, hey, let's make a chart of X, Y, or Z, and it'll just do it for you and be like, okay, so this is a beautiful chart. I just pulled up Excel's chart maker, and just like this is just a screenshot of like the tutorial that they have on the beginning of it. So you can just do this stuff, and it'll make these amazing charts. And we look at them and we can kind of understand what they're doing. But one thing I really want to caution people against as you become a data scientist is not to just blindly trust these tools, and you really want to understand what these tools are doing behind the scenes so that you can kind of understand and explain to somebody when you say, hey, I'm presenting this data, maybe you're trying to make some sort of decision for your company. You don't want to just be like, hey, this tool just spat out this really nice graphic for me, and here it is. You want to be able to explain what's going on behind there, and that'll allow you to kind of really manipulate that data. As I said, there's some great tools for this kind of level 1 stuff. So, the ones that we'll be talking about through this course are Power BI and Excel. Tableau has some great things. Even some of the programming languages, Python has and R both have some great ways to visualize data. Use those. Those are some of the tools that you're going to be wanting to understand and be able to feel pretty comfortable with. But I really want to reemphasize this warning. Before you go and present any type of data, you really want to understand those tools that you're doing and use to get those data into presentable form, because there's nothing worse than going into presentation and grilling the presenter about their data because you see some sort of trend in there and them being like, oh, I don't really understand how I got this information, right? Like, you don't want to be that person as the presenter. Like, understand what's going on. So, but as a level 1 person, you really, taking this idea and like looking at your data and starting to get that data intuition. So like doing the pre-visualization and then understanding what you're doing as kind of your final presentation is absolutely critical. So level 2, in level 2, you're going to be taking data types that are a little bit different. So here's an example of just some node clustering. So basically this idea would be something like Facebook, right? So in Facebook, you have a bunch of friends, and maybe those friends have a certain amount of messages that they send back and forth. So they're going to be closely clustered to you because you're getting lots of messages from them. But there's a few friends out there that you have that maybe are further away. You maybe only send a message to once a month or once a year. They're still connected to you, but they have a lower weight in this particular instance. And so you can start generating these graphics that kind of represent that. And again, you want to be able to explain, what these complicated relationships are in a way that, with a short explanation or a short sort of interaction with your end user, or even a written description for that graphic, they can understand too what you're trying to get across. And so the level 2 stuff is going to be taking data that are maybe not that kind of classical, automatically generated sort of formats from some of these other tools, but maybe some more complicated structures where you're being like, okay, I want to visualize this, maybe this 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional space, such that somebody else can understand it. And so it's kind of more on the analytical side of things. So you can really make some amazing graphics from, if you're kind of in that level 2 space. And these graphics are going to be kind of these design, decision just guiding graphics. So graphics that are going to be like, they really take the user, suck them in, and really give them, a good grip on some data that they might not have had a understanding of beforehand. This includes things like interactive designs, and of course, you're going to still want to know how to apply core analytical methods to these data. So that's kind of the level 2 structure. Again, Power BI and Excel do some of these things for you, but at this point, you're going to be moving into doing stuff with Python or D3.js or R. And I think in the future, it's going to be really interesting because these data sets are getting more complicated, and you're getting these multi-dimensional data sets. And what I mean by multi-dimensional is these are data that have a whole bunch of different types of columns. So every column in a data set you can think of as a dimension that you're going to look at, that you could investigate, right? You could compare, seat number in a car to car weight, right? Those are 2 dimensions that you could graph on an X and a Y. And so, so anything that you can describe as an X and a Y, you can consider a dimension. And so how do you visualize that when you have 500 things about a car in a way that kind of allows somebody to explore that information? So virtual reality, I think, is going to be an interesting tool that people are going to start to use, where you can kind of walk into your data and start to manipulate it. But we'll see. I mean, that's just my speculation. But I think that still fits into this kind of level 2 structure. So, and as I mentioned before, level 3 is kind of going to be a jump. And so right now we're kind of dealing with kind of these classical columnar sorts of data, where you're dealing with data sets that you can kind of make sense of. Level 3 of visualization is going to be kind of this ability to present architectures of experimental designs and how you're going to analyze the data. Because, as I said, data science is also bringing this huge component from machine learning. And machine learning, it's not always about kind of being able to visualize that data from the top down, because you're going to let the machine do a bunch of these experiments and hypotheses. And so you want to be able to tell your end user basically, how are you setting up those parameters for the machine to learn with? And so my view of level 3 data is basically being able to explain clearly what sort of manipulations you're going to let the computer do, such that it can analyze the data for you. Because then you can have a discussion about what those results are. So if you don't have a clear understanding of how you set up your system, and they don't have a clear understanding of how you set up your system, those results really aren't that meaningful, because you don't know how to communicate about them. Because you're like, well, yeah, it predicted what we expected to predict, and it's been really good. It has like an 85% or 95% accuracy rate, but I don't know how it got there, right? So again, you don't want to be that person. You don't want to be like, hey, this is working really well, but I have no idea how it works. So an example of this would be maybe talking about what the neural net would be that you're using. So neural nets are kind of a structure for allowing computers to make decisions. So in these input neurons, pretend that we're visualizing something. Let's say we're visualizing a spider. And so input neuron, that top one on the top left, might be the color black. Is it black? And so it's going to be, okay, so it's either black or not. So that's going to be either on or off. And then the next thing is it shiny? And that's going to be on or off. And the next thing might be, does it have 8 legs? And that's going to be on or off. And the next thing is it touching you? That's going to be on or off. And so those might be some of the inputs that are coming in. And then depending on what inputs are actually firing, those are going to hit these integration neurons and kind of make decisions based on that. So maybe it's black and shiny and has a red piece on it, or a red hourglass on it, but it's not on you. And so that might feed into the integration neurons 2 and 4. And those then send out information to these output neurons. Maybe you leave it alone, or you run away screaming. So depending on what it is, right? And so you kind of want to be able to describe how this decision-making process is going to occur, and then you're going to take a data set or data sample potentially and apply it and say, hey, every time somebody saw a black widow, they ran away screaming. Let's let the machine figure out how to figure that out. So that's kind of where I kind of see level 3 visualization. Like the data that comes back after you've machine learned something could certainly be in a format that you'd apply level 2 and level 1 techniques to, where you're basically saying, hey, these are the results. But to really have a conversation about those results, I think you really need to be able to clearly visualize and make visual graphics that understand and explain to your user and to yourself how your system's set up. And so again, because the majority of us have some visual learning component, I think this is an absolutely critical skill to have to kind of be that next level of visualization core member of a data scientist team. So, kind of the tools that you have for level 3 data, you want to be able to present things all the ways that you could do in level 2, but you also really want to be able to present machine architectures, and so and machine learning architectures. So that's kind of where I see level 3. So that completes our data visualization chapter. And next we're going to talk about data analysis. And in that chapter we'll talk about just how to deal with all these different pieces of data that we're getting in. We'll move on to kind of my view of how to become a data scientist and some of the paths that you can take to becoming a data scientist, and kind of reiterate kind of all the pieces that we've talked about today. And then lastly, we'll just kind of take some of this level 1 skill sets that we've been talking about and just apply it to an Excel or apply it in Excel using a CSV file. So I'm really excited to have you here, and hopefully you'll stick with us for the rest of this program. Thanks. All right, welcome back to the fourth part of our course on data science. So today we're going to just talk about data analysis. Just like the previous 3 chapters, or 2 chapters, we're going to break this up into 3 levels. The first level is going to be kind of just the basic inferential statistics, kind of what you're going to apply to a lot of data types where you're taking all those tools that statisticians have really developed over the last 200 years and just applying them to your data. The second level is going to be kind of taking some of those statistical skills and applying computation to them and kind of using some of these machine learning techniques. And then the third level is really attacking machine learning in a really advanced sort of way. And so we're just going to kind of talk briefly about these things. And as you jump into more and more data science and start learning for yourselves, you'll really talk about the level 2 and level 3 stuff. And application of these things is really a great way to learn it. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about those things, but I am going to talk about some of the trends in data science. And then just kind of give an example of kind of the level one stuff as well. And we'll dive more into that when we do our Excel demonstration. All right, so level 1 stuff. A lot of the level 1 data and becoming a data scientist is kind of understanding these really pervasive tools and skills that we have and have been developed for data science. So and statistics. So one thing that you'll see a lot of times is this bell-shaped curve, this Gaussian curve, and what we call it in data science is a normal curve. And it has a number of rules that describe its behavior. And understanding what those rules are is really important. And so, and also understanding when you can use those tools that have been applied to this Gaussian curve and when you can't apply them. So one thing about data, and one of the things that we learned about data visualization, is that we really need to understand what our data look like before we can actually apply these statistical tools. And so if your data, after you draw a histogram, fits some sort of model that looks like this, then you can probably apply a lot of the kind of classical statistical tools. Once you start to deviate from these shapes, there are other distributions that you can apply different tools to, so Poisson distributions and other types of distributions. And you should start to understand some of those things as well as kind of this level 1 data scientist level, so you can really dig into the data and kind of apply meaningful analyses on it. So the tools that you kind of want to be familiar with, you really want to be pretty competent, using Excel, for example. And if you look at their data analysis toolkit, you should understand what those processes are doing. So that's kind of the level 1 data analysis. Level 2, you're really jumping into, more of the computer science side of things, where you're going to have to be bringing things in and applying maybe machine learning techniques, or again, you might be dealing with big data, and so you're going to not be able to deal with it as easily in a spreadsheet. We're going to have to apply some sort of data frame from either R or Python, or and really figure out and deal with data from a code-based level. And so again, you can do a lot of the things that you can do in Excel or Power BI using code. You can figure out the mean, the median, generate histograms and all those things. But in addition, you're going to start applying some of these machine learning techniques. And the reason that you're going to be doing that is because machine learning has some advantages over kind of our classical skill sets. And so, for multidimensional spaces, especially large dimensional spaces, some of the same structures that you're going to use for like trend lines and best fit curves are just faster to machine learn, surprisingly. So it's a great kind of synthesis of kind of those statistical skills that you kind of understand and learn to apply at the level 1 level, but then start to apply it through code. And then extend that a little bit with machine learning. So one of the things about data science is it's really making this interesting transition at this point, where some of the algorithms that people are generating for machine learning and some of these neural nets are so much better at predicting things that people just apply them and say, hey, these are going to be some fantastic results. And so level 3 is really kind of being able to apply things like Microsoft Cognitive Toolkit or TensorFlow and attack problems, not just from, hey, somebody wrote this algorithm that's really good at recognizing handwriting, I'm just going to apply it, but being able to attack and write some of your own code that's being able to use these tools that take advantage of your graphics processor that can basically spit out a bunch of different hypotheses at once and then analyze those hypotheses very quickly. And so you're really going to be digging into the computer science side of data analysis. So the one that's really the skill that's really taken kind of hold in the last couple of years is neural networks. And so I think that's probably right now kind of the level 3 skill set, but data science is evolving very quickly. So there may be some new data structure that some data scientist comes up with from kind of that white castle of data science, where it's really figuring out how to deal with data best rather than the application side. And they may come up with some other tool that works better, but your goal as a level 3 data scientist is be able to either build your own tools, or if you're just applying those tools, really understand what those tools are that somebody else built. And so both of those are really valuable skills for the level 3 data scientist. And so what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to use Microsoft Cognitive. You want to be able to use TensorFlow and Keras. You want to be able to use Torch at that level and really understand what you're doing. Data analysis is a really fun part of data science. For me, data visualization and data analysis are, well, actually all three pieces are fun, but it's really fun to just finally get your data. You've spent all this time organizing your data. You kind of have a sense of how that data look and kind of their core pieces after visualizing it, making that, and then you're now like finally getting able to jump in and see the results. And so and that's what makes data analysis so fun, is you're finally, all your hard work from before is finally paying off, and you're like, okay, I'm going to actually do stuff. And it's a small piece of the data science life cycle, but it's really a fun place to be. So that's about it for data analysis. Hopefully, as we jump into the Excel, you'll kind of see some of these level 1 applications, again, from data organization to data visualization and a little bit of data analysis kind of come together. So thank you so much.